So when I think about mobile app usage, I think it's probably been on the increase for quite a while, really. I think, especially like over the last 2 years, you think about the pandemic and lockdown situation. I think a lot of companies are, I think there's an app for everything now, isn't there? And I can't really remember the last time that I logged on to my bank via a desktop. I think it's definitely going the way forward that everything's going through an app now on a mobile app. And I think we're starting to see like 90% of users use their mobile to just usually freely use the internet. So it makes kind of sense why fraudsters and cyber criminals have kind of taken advantage of this. And we've started to see more mobile attacks, especially mobile malware. And I think kind of the main kind of how they operate usually is by kind of hijacking the operating systems and then going on to kind of steal personal and financial information and then going on to commit the fraud. So if we have a look at some of the mobile malware trends that we've kind of seen over the last 10 or 15 years, really, and it's kind of like a timeline at the bottom there you can see, and the colors represent the severity of them. So kind of the red ones are the more severe ones that we've seen more recently. So kind of in 2021, we saw one called Flubot and T-Bot, which is the one I'm going to talk about in more detail today. And one we saw in Australia as well, which was called the Vulture Android banking app that we kind of saw towards the end of last year. But yeah, it does seem to be on the rise, really. And mainly the MOs for most mobile malwares is, a social engineering scam where there'll be a phishing email or a text message, or which they'll have to download an app that will then infect the device. They'll harvest into the information, or they might take control of the device using remote access. Usually another typical MO, then they would initiate an overlay, which they'll kind of steal the credentials from the user and then log in using the user information to then go on and commit their kind of fraudulent transactions. Or if they've got if the malware has remote access tools, they'll kind of take control of the device and do that as well. So we mainly kind of see it on the Android platform is kind of the dominant one that we've kind of mainly seen it on, and Trojans can now be found in the Google Play Store. As we are starting to see kind of the steady rise of it, and they are causing quite a lot of high losses within the banks globally. So potentially, if financial institutions haven't got that malware detection and have that controls in place, they might suffer quite large losses. I think a lot of banks have put those desktop controls in place, and now that kind of shift is starting to see on the mobile channel, really, which we are starting to see within Biocatch.
لا يا باشا، لو عايز في البي سي عندي تحت ممكن تفتحه.
Sorry, I'll carry on if that's okay. So yeah, within Biocatch, we're starting to see a steady rise of mobile malware, as kind of mentioned, kind of mainly in 2021. Towards the end of 2021 in Australia, we saw the Vulture Trojan malware, and your bottom right-hand graph you can see that spike for the last kind of Q4, really. And T-Bot, which is the one I'm mainly going to talk about today, which we saw kind of within the UK banks in mid-2021, but it kind of appeared in Europe towards kind of the end of 2020. And the volumes are quite low, but they are starting to kind of steadily rise, which I think will rise more, really, which is kind of crucial to find, to make sure there's controls in place to detect the malware. So, for example, two large UK big banks deployed Biocatch in their mobile app journey in 2021. And with early days of the kind of both deployments, we were able to identify T-Bot through behavioral biometrics. So I'll talk about the T-Bot story now and how it kind of works. So just kind of show you a high-level view of how each step works, and then go into a bit more detail of it. So we'll talk about how the device is infected, how the malware app is installed on the user's device, how the user is then kind of presented with the accessibility services feature, which is kind of a pop-up for the customer to then accept it, which then allows certain permissions on the phone, how the fraudster will then go on to kind of steal the credentials through the malware app or through remote access control to then go on to make the fraudulent transactions on their banking app. So just to go into a bit more detail, so how is the device infected? So the user's device is usually infected by the victim receiving a text message, which usually contain a malicious link. And this is kind of seen quite a lot, I think, in T-Bot and also Flubot as well. So for Flubot, There was mainly behind like postage packages that they'd say like, you know, you need to pay a certain amount of money to go and collect the parcel from well-known postal services, or there'll be a link to a malicious site that they would then click. Teapot is very clever that it kind of masquerades as a normal app. So the user doesn't really know that the app's there, and it kind of masquerades as a media or a postal or logistics service app. So kind of the user doesn't know that when they've clicked on this link, that app's been downloaded and kind of sitting in the background. In recent months, we've kind of seen a shift from maybe not as much as the postal apps being used, but the two-factor authenticating apps and the QR scan code. So in that one we saw in Australia last year, the Vulture Trojan one, the main kind of app that the customers are downloading were this two-factor authenticator. And more recently from other customers, we've kind of seen the QR scan code being used as well. So the MO is slightly changing there. Once it's downloaded, the malware kind of acquires the broad permissions, including the ability to read and intercept text messages and use accessible services, which is kind of a key thing, and delete any applications. So that's how the device is infected. So the device is now infected. The malware starts to scan for applications on the device. And as probably expected, it's going to target apps where they can get money from. So it's going to look for your banking apps, your cryptocurrencies. And the bank apps that I'm showing you now were actually in the configuration of a malware. So these were the actual banks that the malware was targeting that we are aware of. And these are UK and European banks. Once kind of the malware knows that this user's device has got one of these targeted applications, the accessibility service pop-up will appear. And that will appear consistently until the user accepts it. So it'll keep on doing it until they accept it. Once they allow them to accept it, so when they've clicked that accept button, Tbot then can listen for any time that one of those apps, for example, that banking app, is open, and listen to what the customer is doing on their device. And this is how they kind of steal the credentials now, really. So as it's listened, Tbot is listening to the fact that this customer is now going to log onto their banking app. The overlay attack will start. And what Tbot does is downloads the specifically crafted login page for the application. So it'll present the customer with what they kind of typically see when they log in, like it'll look basically what their normal app will look like, but it will override the biometric and Face ID. So it will force them to force them to put their passcode in, which obviously the malware will kind of scrape, and they've got that information then. This allows obviously to collect the data for the credentials, which is kind of one of the key capabilities of Tbot, is the key logging capabilities, and send it back to this control and command server, which is a capability of Tbot. So now they've infected the device, they've got the customer's details, they can now log on and make the payments. So this is how the fraudulent transactions are made. So they have now the ability to log in, they've got the passcode to log in, and they can go ahead and transfer any money out of their bank account. And how it kind of does it is, so one of the key differences between Tbot and Flubot is has remote access capability. So what Tbot does, it remotely accesses the user's device. And what was quite interesting when we started to see these cases was that they were payments and logins being made very early hours in the morning. So you can have a look there on the right hand side. The kind of high volume case that we're seeing between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, suggesting that either a person is remotely accessing the customer's device or the user's device, or a computer is doing it, and they're doing it at a time where the customer is not going to be using their device at all. Like they're not knowing that this is going on. It's probably on their bedside table where these transactions are being made very, very secretly, really, if you think about it. So that's how kind of like Tbot works, from the device being infected to the point in which where the transactions are being made. Just want to kind of quickly talk through as well the kind of key difference between Flubot and Tbot as well. So Flubot was something that we also saw last year, and the kind of key differences are quite similar in some ways, but different in other ways. So the kind of text message initial part of the kind of attack is very similar. So they both would send like a text message where a malicious link would encourage the user to download the app. And that was kind of a similar thing that we see across Flubot and Tbot. The app would then be downloaded, and it would kind of exist as a normal kind of app that the user wouldn't be aware of. That was kind of similar on both Flubot and Tbot. The kind of key permission for Fluebot, which is quite an interesting one, is that they had the ability to access the user's phone book and contact list. So if you think about how that kind of MO would, that attack would start, was actually sending a text message. So if they've already infected someone's device, they've got their phone number, they're going to get the phone numbers of that user's device. So it kind of spreads quite quickly, the fraud attack. And that was one of the main permissions that kind of Fluebot exploited really. On the T-bot side, it's got a few more applications where, the application had multiple permissions really, where it prompted the users to enable the accessibility service, which is kind of a key thing for T-bot really. One of the other kind of differences, I guess, is that Fluebot doesn't have a remote access tool. So it has a similar capabilities to T-bot where it can scrape the credentials, but it doesn't have the remote access ability that T-bot did have. And as quite interesting, I think the key difference is the remote access ability. So kind of on the Fluebot cases that we saw, a lot of the logins were from a third-party login. So we knew that the device was not the user's because it's been logging on from a new device. However, on the T-bot side, because they're remotely accessing the customer's device, it looks like it is the user logging in. So behaviorally, what can we do to identify through T-bot what was different between the fraud session and the genuine session? This is what I'll talk a bit more detail about now, about behaviorally how we could detect T-bot between the genuine user and the fraud user as well. So how can we detect T-bot in Biocatch? So this is just like a high level summary case of one of the banks that deployed us last year to help on the mobile app journey. So kind of high level summary of the case is it had a high account takeover score, which based on our model, which suggests the account is being taken over by someone else. Mobile rat was detected. So as kind of mentioned, T-bot has rat capabilities, and we were able to detect that as part of this case, which helps kind of detect the malware. However, there's kind of more kind of risk signals that we can identify as not just rat to help identify T-bot. So kind of the key things that and usually malware is quite different, how malware behaves in the kind of in the fraud population is very different to the genuine population. That's a key thing that we can see. So the kind of behaviors that we started to see on these malware cases was how the user would navigate through the path of the journey. So when they logged onto the banking app, how quickly they navigated through the session, how the device was, the touch points, how the device was positioned, and also accelerometer data and touch and swipe patterns. So kind of these key behavioral things that we can help identify T-bot. So I'll go into a bit more detail of how we can see that within our data at Biocatch. So this is the session flow. So on your left-hand side, you've got your fraud session. On the right-hand side, you've got your genuine session. You can see these color blocks if you have a look on the fraud and the genuine side. And the smaller the block, the quicker the user was in that part of the flow. So maybe at the point where they were adding a new payee, it's a very short period of time that they were in that part of the banking app flow when they were making the payment, which suggests that they are very familiar with the flow and complete the payments at high speeds. Where if you look at the genuine side, you've got your longer color bars, which is suggesting that they are taking longer. And that's kind of what we typically saw for that genuine user. So that was kind of a key indicator of where we could see that the fraud session, they were quickly navigating, very, very familiar with the path compared to the genuine user that they kind of were slower to navigate. And that's because we saw that kind of a genuine session prior to this fraud session. It enabled us to see the difference. If we have a look at the accelerometer insight data, so if you have a look at this graph, you can see the blue lines and the gray line, or the gray squiggly lines. So your blue lines represents the accelerometer movement for the current session. So that's our fraud session that we're looking at now. And then your gray lines represent the historical accelerometer data, which is for the user's previous sessions, because we knew that the genuine user kind of logged on, I think it was about 8 days, before. So we've got that history of what the genuine user's doing, and we're comparing it to the fraud one now. So as the blue lines are completely flat, it's actually representing that the device is flat. And if you think about how the MO was happening during the middle of the night, where the customer had probably maybe the phone on the bedside table, the device will be completely flat. Where if you think about when you're holding your mobile and making the transaction, you're obviously naturally going to move it. And that's kind of suggesting what the genuine user would usually do. where we could identify here that this was actually a fraud session because the device wasn't moving at all, wasn't moving at all, basically. So there's another good comparison of where we can see behaviorally what the fraud session's doing and the genuine session's doing differently. And also we can look at the swipe and touch events as well. So, which is another quite interesting thing to see. So on your left-hand side, you've got your fraud, touch and swipe sessions and your genuine use got you on the right-hand side. So as you can see, there's like those squiggly lines there. So they're quite straight on the fraud session, which basically is like a perfectly straight line. And if you think about when you swipe on your phone, it's never really a straight line, is it? It's usually like, we've got fingers and thumbs that are curved, they kind of move. So it kind of, that seemed quite not typical of what a genuine user or a human person would do, which gives us another clear indication that this could be a fraud session that indicates that it's actually being remotely accessed from another device. Also, the touch events, you can see like the little squiggly little dots there. They're very precise on the fraud session, which again is suggesting that it's potentially not human behavior. And in the center of the screen as well, where if you look on the genuine side, a lot of the straight lines are actually curved, which makes sense if you think about how you kind of swipe on your mobile phone, but also they're predominantly on the right-hand side. And I know when I pick up my phone and I'm right-handed that I probably swipe more on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. So again, we were able to establish that this fraud session that we were seeing, the swipe events were very different to what the genuine user was looking like. So it's like, if you think of your left-handed as well, potentially you'd probably maybe swipe more on the left-hand side. Again, with your touch events, with your human touch events, they're a bit more squidgy. If you have a look at those little black dots there, if you can see them. And if you think about when you actually kind of press your phone or you touch it, it's never a precise dot. It's always like a bit of a smudge, which again represents what a genuine person would do. So kind of the no movement of any touch events suggests again that it's remotely controlled. And the swipe events and touch events are completely different from the kind of normal genuine user that we see. So that was another way that we could identify that this was a malware case and help identify that it was a fraud malware case. So that was everything I wanted to talk to you guys.